Okay, looks like it's working. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Johanna Munoz, and for my final wrongful conviction case study, I will be discussing the case of Glenn Ford. This is my assigned case. So, in this presentation, um, I have organized it into five main areas, like the assignment said. I will give a short case snapshot. I will explain the main wrongful conviction pathways of the case. I will look at key evidence and procedural failures, and I will discuss the narrative, legitimacy, and public meaning, especially in the role of media framing. Lastly, I will end the systematic implications of the case and what it reveals about capital punishment broadly. Um, what makes Glenn Ford's case so important is that it was not just one thing that went wrong. It was not one bad witness or a bad lawyer. It was not just one evidence either. This case was several failures together, and this is why this case is such a strong example of how wrongful convictions happen and why they can survive for decades. Here in our slide two, the case snapshot. So to begin, Glenn Ford was prosecuted in Caddo Parish, Louisiana, in 1993 robbery and murder of Isidore Roseman, who was a white Jewish, a white jeweler in Shreveport. So Ford was charged in 1984, tried later that same year, convicted of first-degree murder, and then sentenced to death in 1985. He remained on death row for nearly 30 years before his conviction was finally vacated in 2014. When he was released, the charges were dismissed, and he died in 2015 after only a short period of freedom. I think this short snapshot is important because it gives us the scale of the error right away. Ford was not simply wrongfully accused or even just wrongfully convicted. He was sentenced to die, and that makes the case a little bit different. It gets weight. Um, so a wrongful conviction is always serious, but when the death penalty is involved, I mean, every earlier failure becomes more dangerous because the punishment is irreversible. That's the main thing about it. Another thing that stands out in the case in this snapshot is the amount of time involved. This was not a short detention followed by release. He lost nearly 3 decades of his life. So even before we get into the causes of the wrongful conviction, the timeline itself shows that this was not a system that corrected itself quickly. It was a system that protected its own mistakes for years. So in slide three, we see the wrongful conviction pathways. Um, and the wrongful conviction pathways in Glad's Ford case, um, let's discuss those. The biggest one, in my understanding, was official misconduct. The state's case was shaped by the failure to disclose exculpatory information, including evidence pointing more directly toward Jake and Henry Robinson, if you remember, who those were the other suspects. In my understanding, they were the stronger suspects. Contradictory witness information was not fully turned over for the defense either. And this is important because the jury did not hear the full picture, and the defense was deprived of the opportunity to challenge the state's theory as effectively as it should have. In other words, misconduct shaped what even looked like inside the courtroom. The second major pathway was inadequate defense. So Ford's court-appointed lawyer had almost no real criminal trial experience, and they had no capital defense experience. As if this was already bad enough, but it gets worse. According to the papers I wrote in the semester, they also had little understanding of how to obtain expert funding or subpoena important witnesses. And that means the defense was weak, not only in strategy, but also in basic capacity. So when the prosecution presented its case, there was not enough force on the other side to really test it. The third pathway was forensic overstatement. The prosecution relied on gunshot gunshot residue, fingerprint testimony, and Kerner's reconstruction in ways that made the case sound much stronger than it really was. A lot of wrongful convictions happen when evidence sounds scientific and objective, even when the actual reliability is weak or limited. And that's what happened here. The fourth pathway was witness and informant instability. In later statements, pointed more clearly toward, you know, Jake Robinson, who was the other suspect. One witness later said that detectives had fabricated parts of the answers. So again, what looked stable at trial became much less reliable when examined more closely later. So when I ranked the pathways, I would say the two biggest were official misconduct and defense inequality. The other failures became even more harmful because of these two. Weak evidence is dangerous enough, but weak evidence becomes far more dangerous when prosecutors suppress contradictory material and the defense lacks the ability to fight back. Slide number 4. All right. The third section is the key evidence and procedural failures. The first major evidentiary problem was the gunshot residue evidence. See, that sounds scientific, but it, and it isn't. And in court, it probably gave it a lot of persuasive force with the jury. But later reviews showed that it had been collected too late to carry strong scientific value. In one of my earlier papers, I pointed out that it was collected more than 24 hours after the murder. That is a major limitation, and yet it was still used in a way that helped the prosecution's theory appear stronger. The second problem was the fingerprint evidence. Um, the analyst did not make a conclusive identification. Instead, what the court heard was the print showed a whorl type pattern, and that pattern was very common. So again, the evidence did not definitely place forward at the scene, but in the courtroom it still sounded specific and persuasive. The third problem was the left handed shooter theory based on the coroner reconstruction. The prosecution used that theory to connect the crime to Ford because he was left handed, but later review described the theory as speculative. And this is important to note because courtroom reconstructions can sound neat and convincing, but if they depend too heavily on interpretation and assumptions, then they may mislead the jury more than they can help it. Another major failure involved witness credibility. One witness later said detectives had fabricated answers and that she had lied. That is important because witness testimony often helps stitch together a circumstantial case. Once those statements weaken, the whole structure starts to crack. But these evidentiary failures alone do not explain why the conviction lasted as long as it did. This is where procedural failures matter. Exculpatory evidence about alternative suspects was not turned over to the defense. Ford's lawyers were underprepared and under resourced. And even later, when serious weaknesses surfaced, the courts still treated the conviction with deference. Um, a post conviction hearing in 2004 produced important evidence undermining the forensic case and exposing undisclosed police reports, but relief was still denied. That tells us something very important. You know, it tells us that the problem was not only bad evidence at trial, the problem was also a system that resists correcting its own errors. That is crucial. So, if I had to summarize the takeaway from this section, I would say weak evidence stayed powerful because the defense was underprepared and the courts favored finality over correction. Once the state secured a conviction, Ford had to carry the burden of providing that the system was wrong, even though many of the original failures were created by the system itself. Next slide. So, narrative, legitimacy, and public meaning. This section is about narrative, legitimacy, and public meaning. This is where the case becomes more than just a story about legality. It's public now. In the early stage of the case, media coverage centered on the crime, the arrest, the danger of the accused. See, and that reporting often relies heavily on police and prosecutors because those are the easiest and most official sources available at the time. The problem is that this kind of coverage can make the accused look guilty before the evidence has actually been tested. And that's what happened in Ford's case. The early framing allowed the pattern of crime, fear, and ultimately guilt. There was a long period of silence. Ford remained on death row for years with very little public attention, and that silence is very important because it makes the conviction appear settled, done, stable, and no longer worthy of serious scrutiny. In other words, silence can legitimize a conviction almost as much as dramatic early headlines can. Only much later, after exoneration, did the narrative shift. Media coverage then focused on shock, innocence, and the moral failure of the system. Reporting became more crucial in the state. Race, official misconduct, weak defense, and the human damage of the case became much more visible. But by then, the damage had already been done. Ford had already spent nearly 30 years on death row. And this is why I think this section is really about legitimacy. Early public storytelling helped normalize the state's theory. Later storytelling challenged it, but only after decades of institutional harm. So the question is, when does a justice system lose legitimacy? I think Ford's case shows that legitimacy is damaged not just when the wrong person is convicted, but when public narrative helps support that conviction early and only doubts it after the human cost has become irreversible. So I think that race has to be mentioned here as well. Ford was a black man accused of killing a white victim, and the case was tried before an all white jury. Even when media coverage does not say race directly, racial framing can still shape how dangerous, credible, or sympathetic a defendant appears. So public meaning in this case cannot be separated from race. Next slide. The final section is systematic implications and reform insight. Glenn Ford's case shows that capital punishment operates within a system that is highly vulnerable to layered failure. This was not one small mistake that slipped through the system. This was a case where official misconduct, inadequate defense, weak evidence, racial inequality, and ultimately delayed correction all reinforced one another. That is what makes the case important, beyond Glenn Ford himself. It reveals a systematic problem and not only a tragedy of a case. In theory, several reforms might have reduced the risk. Stronger Brady compliance and disclosure rules might have exposed alternate suspects earlier. Better indigent defense funding and training might have given forth competent presentation. Stricter standards might have prevented weak residue evidence and speculative reconstruction from being overstated. Stronger post conviction review might have corrected the case earlier once major doubts emerged. Those reforms are all important. And based on my earlier work, they probably could have changed this case in various meaningful ways. But I also think the case shows the limits of reform. Even if reforms reduce the risk of error, they cannot erase irreversible harm once a death sentence is entered and upheld for decades. Glenn Ford lost nearly 30 years of his life. He was released too late for the system to truly repair what it had done. He died soon after release. So when we ask whether reform could have prevented the error, I think the answer is partly yes. But when we ask whether reform can repair the full damage after the fact, the answer is simply no. And that is why I think that the case raises a basic legitimacy problem for the death penalty itself. Capital punishment assumes a level of reliability the criminal justice system simply cannot guarantee. If the system can produce a case like this, protect it for decades, and only correct it after most of a person's life has already been taken, then the death penalty becomes not just a punishment, but a legitimacy issue. Okay. Okay, I think that's all my slides. So, in conclusion, Glenn Ford's wrongful conviction was not the result of one isolated failure. It came from multiple overlapping failures: official misconduct, inadequate defense, overstated forensic evidence, unreliable witness information, racial inequality, and delayed correction. The public narrative early on helped normalize guilt, while later reporting exposed innocence only after decades of damage had already been done. And at the broadest level, the case shows that capital punishment is built on a reliability that the real justice system cannot deliver. For me, this is the central lesson of Glenn Ford's case. It's not just that the system got it wrong once, it's also that the system had many opportunities to get it right and failed repeatedly. That is my case. This is my presentation. Thank you.